to America's Tax Tuesday. Just kidding, it's not Tuesday, it's Wednesday. Psych. This day in America, if you're watching outside America, is when everyone's supposed to have filed their tax returns. Things about tax returns are exciting to me, nerdily. I like numbers. I feel like I'm the kid who says I like turtles when I say that. Anyway, one thing about numbers I think is cool is the way we can take numbers and represent them with images that one maybe could call infographics. Before you was one I created. Maybe you can figure out what it's showing. If you're not like seeing it yet, it is a geometrical representation of the United States of America based on population size. So maybe you've seen maps like this in the past. I like maps. I like demographics. Demographics under another name is called political or identity politics. You know, whatever. Measuring people gets political. When we get these types of numbers, we can represent them. This map that I made shows data from the 2020 census represented into geometrical shapes that are representative or representational of each state's and territory's percentage of the overall population. Some key things to notice are that when states and territories are represented this way, they don't hold the same shape, and they, because of that shape changing, don't always connect in the same way as they would, if you think of a puzzle, right? If you change the size of pieces in the puzzle, they're not going to fit together. So when you do the same with the states of the United States, and maybe you want to do this project with where you live based on the data your government collects. And, this isn't a conversation about whether we trust our government's data, but we are saying that this is the data that we have, however much you have trust in it, right? So this data from the 2020 census put out in the United States, again, that was a census done during the pandemic, if you remember. The data was collected, and data has been collected since then, and there's ways, like for instance, through tax returns to look at data of who is where they're paying taxes, is that where they're living, who is living in that household. Tax information has a lot of that information as well. What it might not have is things that some people think are also interesting, like what is a person's origins or background or things like that when they look at demographics. But first, let's just look at the numbers. These numbers also are important in what we call a representational democracy, like we have in name in the USA. These numbers are also where we get the reapportioning, is that the right word? Reallocating of, for instance, state representative numbers, and like for like the House of Congress, House of Representatives in the Congress, forgive me, and also for the Electoral College, which is this extra layer that our federal government adds to the popular presidential elections to make sure it's not actually a popular vote, but it's a representative vote. And that gets into what this map is showing. If you have some familiarity with US history, the states closest to this We're going to call it coast. It's not this. Don't think about these right now. These represent 5 territories that are not states. There's another territory called the District of Columbia or the DC that is also a territory. But anyway, that's contiguously part of the USA. So I put it with the part of the map essentially that's here. These 5 territories are not states. And then these 2 disconnected states, if you recognize, are Alaska and Hawaii. These, if you didn't know, are Virgin Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and American Samoa, and that's Puerto Rico. Anyway, something else I put in this map is I changed the shape I used if the state represented at least 1% of the total US population. I did some rounding to make this map possible, but the states that don't, and territories, forgive me, that don't yet represent at least 1% of the US population, I put as green circles. I guess kind of like a 0, but they're also placeholders because I wanted to make the map recognizable. But they don't have each of these locations or spaces, geographic locations within the USA don't have enough people within them to make up 1% of the USA. Now together they make up, an amount of percentages, but anyway, I'll get to the numbers data that I have in an Excel doc. And look, I'm using Microsoft. Oh no. Anyway, I could probably make this type of map using other office suites like through Google or other, platforms, but I chose to use it through Word, and there is a purpose for that. It's because I want the process that I use to make this to seem easy enough for others to use. It's a big motive in a lot of the technological decisions I make and how I create videos on YouTube. But enough about that. If you look for maybe your location, if you are an American resident, or maybe you are curious, you might see them represented by 2-letter abbreviations that we have for our postal codes in the United States of America. I live in Illinois, so Illinois is represented by 4 squares, and that means that Illinois, in this simplified version of a percentage map of the USA, Illinois represents 4% of America. If we look at other states, California, for instance, represents 12% of America. New York, half of that, along with Florida, half of that, represent 6% each of of the United States of American population. New Jersey, 3, Pennsylvania, 4, Ohio, 4. So this you can start to see as the sizes of the populations determines the power of the state in a federal democratic republic, which is what America is in name and on the documents and all that. So remember, maybe you don't remember, I'm going to tell you, the United States started as 13 colonies along this Atlantic coast. Again, don't imagine these 5 territories here. They're geographically not actually in those locations. Maine wasn't a state yet. And I don't think Vermont was a state yet. West Virginia was part of Virginia. The DC didn't exist yet, so something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. I think Maine was a part of Massachusetts before it became its own state, and Vermont was just a territory, but I don't quite remember. That's where I'm getting wrong on American history. It's kind of like skewed facts that were like taught during those, I think we learned it 7th grade, maybe even 6th grade the American history, I don't quite remember. Each state in the USA also teaches their education curriculum differently. So if you live in a different state than Illinois, or if you don't live in the USA, you probably learned the same history differently or didn't learn it. Anyway, those 13 states were all along this coast, colonies they were, and then they became states when, America gained its independence from the British Crown, da 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 da. But those states didn't all have the same population. So in a democracy, population is king, but at the same time, they wanted each state to have a little bit of equality. And that's where, if you didn't know, the creation of the Senate versus the House of Representatives came from the bicameral Congress, right? Two chambers of Congress. So each state gets two senators, but then each state is apportioned at least one um, a House of Representative person. Now that's, again, DC, and these 5 territories do not have elected, well, they do. They don't have senators. They had the Virgin Islands and DC have representatives, though they're non-voting, in the House of Representatives. And they are elected by the residents of those territories, but they are not voting members of the House of Representatives. But none of these territories have senators. So that's a big thing. That's why there's only 100 senators. But the House of Representatives, I think it's 358. 338, 358. I'm blanking. That's not important. You can find that out. But anyway, this was a simplification of the numbers. When we get to the numbers, it gets a little bit, I would say, more interesting. So I also based this map based on the numbers from the 2020 census. And I know that during the pandemic, people died. I know that since certain policies have changed, people have left, whether by choice or by force. That's a whole another conversation beyond this video's scope. But then, not always do we get, like, we're not going to have another census until 2030, across the whole government. So there sometimes are ways of tracking population and keeping account of it through other ways that states and maybe even municipalities like cities and towns will publish. And then I kind of piece those together to make a growth comparison of these states because this is based on 2020, so they might change. And let's see. So if you see how the data is broken down, there's a state name. I put them by alphabetical first. Then there's an actual raw population number in that state or territory, and then that percentage of the total. So that's an easy thing you can do through Excel formulas. And I put it I times it by 100 as you see to make it like a percentage. 1.5%. Then I made it simple. I rewrote it or retyped it, right? To make it simple, learn to read, because percentages are kind of, it gets clumsy when you get them past the 10th space. And then because percentages are, I had to sometimes expand beyond the 10th position of the decimal to differentiate between two state sizes. So like, for instance, sometimes there are two states that have a similar percentage, like Kentucky and Louisiana. But if you expand them, okay, Louisiana is a little bit bigger. See what I did there? If you look at the raw numbers, yeah, Louisiana is bigger by like 10,000 people, 12,000 people. But also, remember, these numbers aren't, let's say, consistent. And what I mean by that is some of these numbers are from 2021. Some of these numbers are from early 2026. So that's why I have 2026 with that asterisk there. It doesn't mean they're from 2026. It means they're from after 2020. And no matter if the consistency of that date, I got this number, what I'm showing mainly through this data is that there's a change, right? So this change might not be fully representative yet, as it will be clearly representative in 2030, how much has changed, you know, with like an even count, because like each state will be counted at the same time, whereas this amalgamation is like a mixture of dates. So it's a little less accurate. But you can see still, even with this less accuracy, there are trends starting to emerge of drops in populations, growths in populations. I chose an orangey color to show drops and like a negative change, right? And a green to show growth and blue to kind of show stagnancy. So you can see that in this middle column, and you can find your state. I'm trying to scroll slowly so people, or territory, forgive me, so you can see what you gotta see. And then down here I did the total. So, in total, supposedly, in this mix of, there's like been growth in the USA, like so that's happening, and it's a million people have grown. What is that? More million people have been added to the USA since 2020. But again, this number isn't consistent geographically. As I said, some of the numbers I had to source from like data that was pooled in 2021. Some of the numbers are sourced from data that was like as fresh as like the start of 2026. And if you think about it, the numbers from the start of 2026 are kind of actually numbers from the end of 2025. If you think about how like data processing goes. But anyway, let's get to all the 2020 data, because this gets into a little more of the demographics that I think is fun. That sounds weird to say. Fascinating. And I say it's fascinating because I am part of a mixed family. So some of the ways that data is counted and some of the things that are counted, they imply things about, as I said, the same term demographics could also be thought of as identity politics based on what things we are counting about people, right? In America, there has been a long history of very racialized topics, you know, things that are very, just very racialized. So a lot of topics get a racial lens in the USA because it has such an important impact on our history. If you are an American, you certainly should know that. If you aren't an American, you probably know that as well from just the media that's produced about America. Although I don't know all the media you're seeing, but I know it's not like hidden America's past with racism. Present. What am I saying? Past. Present. Again, I have the same numbers from 2020. Wait, do I have? This is different data. So I have the 2020 numbers here. This is just expanded. When this little middle column is where I got the number that would then show up in the amount of squares a state is comprised of. So if you see the number, that's very simplified. This is the expanded percentage, so I could do a better assessment. This expanded number became what I then used to create these representations of each state's racial breakdown. So what did I do here? So I got these numbers from each state's census data. And one thing I want to state right off the bat is that the censuses between states didn't always ask for racial and ethnic information with the same words. And this is important because what it then creates is, in this raw data, if you see, I'll click it here, if the contrast isn't fun for you to see, I simplified it: white, black, Latino, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, other, and mixed. Not every census asked about mixed, and not every census asked about Latino. And so I had to do some interpreting of, I didn't want to have some states showing Latino and some states showing mixed and not the other. So I did a little bit of blending, forgive me. So I put all of this Latino number in the mixed if there were, like I called it all the same. If there are states where both are counted, you know, I hope that isn't a double count. But if we look at, I think there was a phase of my data analysis where I tried to make sure it wasn't a double count anywhere, because I looked at like what the total was and what it would add up to. So I don't think that happened, but let's get into what these colors look like, what they represent. I try to play with the ways the color representation looked, but what I thought was most interesting was how each state was and territory was broken down. So if you see down here, I did the totals, and this helps you think about the racial and ethnic breakdown of the United States of America. And if you think about this, this is roughly in percentages. So if you, in 2020, if we think about it, 59%, 59.23% of the USA was white. Okay, only about 13%, 12.9% of America in 2020 was black. 6.59% of America in 2020 was Asian. 1.37% of America was Native American. 0.3% of America was Pacific Islander. 1.664% of America was other. Again, I don't know what that means when someone checks other, but ta-da, it was checked. And then this blended group is 21.1% of America is Latino or mixed, because again, I put those categories together since not all states measured both, and when I did measure both, I hoped there wasn't a recount, and I tried to do some data digging to see if there wasn't, and I'm pretty sure before I put this all together, I made sure that. But it could be wrong. It's data, it's numbers, it's murky. Even we could count, you could get into the conversation whether these data is, truth or whether it's, still propaganda. I chose different ways to represent colors, a little bit using like the names given by dumb racial science in the past about groups. So like, there's this dumb way of identifying Native Americans as red. I don't agree, but I just used it for this representation so it could resonate a little more. The color purple. That's why I chose for black folk. You know, Asian. I don't like it, but like that dumb thing about yellow, right? So Pacific Islanders live in water, others kind of grayish, mixed, I kind of see America as mixed, so I chose the American colors to represent it as, if there's less mix, it's red. If there's more mix, it's blue, and then white, because white people think other people are aliens. Not all of them, obviously, I'm exaggerating. I put white as white and green is not. So what you need to see from here, that's crazy, is that California, out of any of these places, has the most white people. But yet, despite California having the most white people out of any of these other places, it's still within California, not as much as the mixed population. So California has more mixed, that would be the clumping together of mixed and Latino people, because if you look at the raw data, they don't have mixed on the California census. They would have had to mark other. They have L Latino. And California is more mixed or Latino than white, but it's still the amount of white people in California is still more than every other amount of white people in every other state in the USA or territory, even Texas, right? Again, Texas is still more mixed or Latino than white. And this, I think, whole deal, this whole whether it's mixed or Latino more than white or whatever, is I think a big reason politically why Puerto Rico isn't going to be um, politically pushed into statehood by, at least not by the Republican Party, because you can see this, not the skew, but like the way that the population is spread in either raw numbers here or the way that it's represented here, you know, people identify mostly as other or mixed slash Latino. And actually, people in Puerto Rico don't really, they didn't even, they have Latino on their census because it didn't make sense. So they try to like say, what's your non-Latino origin? So like, even the people who call themselves white in Puerto Rico are probably people who think of themselves as white, but they might be considered by a lot of other people in continental USA as Latino because that gets into a whole topic about, what names are used for people. Because Latino is a relatively new group name. And it is definitely based on just North and South America context. Same with Black a little bit. And Native American, I guess, a little bit. But nonetheless, that gets the whole like idea of like these names being chosen for certain reasons. What's also interesting is what I did with these bars, and you can scroll through. I ranked them by individual group. So, for instance, there are, if you want to like say, which state has the most Native American folk in it? And it's gonna be, I think, Texas. Oh no, California, 15. And then Texas is the second. And then you have these states like Oklahoma, or some other Arizona, where there's still a sizable amount of the total. So this is like percentage of within that state. Not percentage. This is not a percentage. This is like a number that represents amount. I don't know how, so when I broke each state's population here, I took this number 150 and then I took the percentages from here. So this 100 is 100%. This is, instead of, sorry, I misspoke, and this was percentages down here. This is parts of the whole. And each part is based on a percentage. But so like this, yeah. So a little bit of the, yeah. I think when the math turned out, each of these ones represents a hundredth of a percentage of the population. So this isn't 100% of the state. This is 100 out of this 150. So essentially 2/3 of Alabama then is white. That's what that means. And then a little bit less than 1/3 of Alabama is black. And then the rest of Alabama is represented through Asian, Native, other, and mixed. And of course, mixed could be people who call themselves mixed. Well, for this, you can see here, L, Latino, mixed, as I have it here, is representing actually a Latino population. So like if you think about, if for instance we want to think about which state, this is going to sound weird, has the largest black population for like, let's say like if you want to make sure you live in an area with a lot of, more people who maybe look like you. It's a common thing that white people think about. I'll just let you know. It's Texas. So like, Texas is in a way the most black state of the USA. But a close second is Florida. I mean, Georgia. Georgia. That is the second blackest. That's a weird. The state with the second largest amount of black people. Sorry, I'm going really fast. So maybe let's go slower. And I did this. We can comment on the color choices. We can comment on what the numbers are and how I chose to represent them. When it comes to Pacific Islanders, you can see that the state that has the most Pacific Islanders is California, which is interesting because Pacific Islanders means people from Alaska or Hawaii, like their origins. And it's, Alaska doesn't even have, I guess the people in Alaska consider themselves Native American. Because again, this is how people identify, right? People in Alaska don't consider themselves Pacific Islanders. I guess that means people from Hawaii. But then it's absurd to look at this. Look, literally, there are double the number of people of Hawaiian and Pacific Islander ancestry living in California than there are in Hawaii, like by numbers. So, and then like the next place that has a large number of Pacific Islanders is Washington State. So maybe if you're a person with Pacific Islander ancestry and want to connect to your roots or live around a community where maybe there are restaurants of Pacific Islander cuisine or something, you would think about like where do a lot more people like me or like that culture live, right? Maybe you want to live in an area with a lot more Asian neighborhoods or population centers. California certainly keeps showing up, and it outsizes all the rest of the areas with populations of Asian descent, right? The next biggest, it looks like, is New York, right? So one could take each of these and be like, which state has the most? Florida's pretty high up there for a number of black people. Another one is New York. If you're looking at Asian, it's like California, and then it jumps all the way down to, New York, and then Texas, right? You don't think in your brain like, oh, Texas is so Asian, but according to this, it's the state with the third largest Asian population in the USA, right? You don't think of, maybe you do. When we think of in our brains the cultural and media portrayal of Native America, we might think of more like a Arizona or a New Mexico, not a California necessarily, but it's California that is top, and then Texas, again, we don't think of that necessarily in our brains as like that's where Native Americans live. We might even think of Oklahoma, which actually, it is tying with third with Arizona for the third number of Native Americans living. And then when you think, where is New Mexico? Because I thought New Mexico had a large group, and that's only 6. So it's like, this is about actual numbers of people, which, North Carolina has more people with Native American ancestry than New Mexico. And that's like, in my brain, something I wouldn't think is real when you like look at the actual state of New Mexico itself. Here, within New Mexico, Native American people are a large proportion of that state, but it's not like whereas in North Carolina, Native American people aren't a large proportion of that state, but there are more Native American people still living in North Carolina than there are living in New Mexico. And that's just a part of like the way that demographics is kind of interesting to me, though it can kind of upend our assumptions about who is where, right? I did similar research like this when I was in my library master's. Like, where are the libraries? Who's going to library school? Where are the library schools? Are the librarians, where are the librarians being trained from? Right. So down here, I got a little more side nerdy, and I was like, okay, let's look at cities, and let's also rank them by percentage. So, like, if you want to actually rank them, California has in 2020, California represented 11.8% of the American population. Texas was 8.7, Florida was 6.4, New York was 6, Pennsylvania was 3.9, and at 6 was my state, Illinois, in 2020. I didn't do this for 2026, this fake 2026 kind of, but it could be done where you do this, you rearrange the data by, you um, sort and filter it by population percentage, right? And then if you think with the top 5 cities, 2.6% of Americans live in New York City. And that's why what happens in New York City is so big, because there are states of the United States that have less percentage weight of the population than New York City. If you look at LA, 1.2% of America lives, at least in 2020, lived in LA. And then same with Houston, Chicago, and Phoenix, each have less than 1%, but still a sizable like percentage still for one city we're talking about, like, right? Each of these cities are larger in percentage than some states' weight. Phoenix, the city of Phoenix itself has more demographic weight than the entire state of Hawaii, right? So that's why like Arizona's so big with like swing votes and all that, the presidential elections. And that's where these election talks and these demographic dives by CNN or Kornacki on MSNBC or other maybe sources you look for. That's where these dives kind of get into like election data, kind of get revelatory about who votes for what and why and who's going to swing which way in the next and all those prediction markets and stuff. And this is the base of it. And then fun representations like this are a way that, we can kind of interpret reality, but kind of see it for what it really is. Thanks for listening to that demographic dive into a side project of mine. I like this kind of stuff. If you do too, maybe you want to, leave a comment, thumbs up, encourage me to keep filming content like this. Peace and blessings.